Nearwood had our very own lavender town. October 13th, 2010, halfway through the broadcast of the local kids' television show, Mrs. Blinky's Playhouse. A high-pitched screeching sound played for exactly 2.5 minutes, frying the brains of 10 children who had been watching the show, and permanently altering the minds of the rest of the town's kids, with parents who managed to switch the TV set off before their children's brains, quite literally, burst. Mrs. Blinky's Playhouse was the best and only kids' TV show that we had. Sure, we had cable and Nickelodeon, but our usual TV channels were the news, an adult station I caught my dad watching sometimes, and Mrs. Blinky's Playhouse between channels 6 and 7. The show was broadcast on a local station and never left our town. It was special to us as kids. Mrs. Blinky and her gang felt like friends, or even family members, often visiting us at school on special occasions, and holding competitions where we could actually write letters to Mrs. Blinky. So, we opted to watch it instead of SpongeBob. The show consisted of exactly what you would think, and don't expect me to describe it in much detail, because I have barely any memory of the original run. It was bright and colourful, featuring 4 absurdly dressed live-action creatures, with names someone had clearly come up with by using a dartboard and hoping for the best. Mrs. Blinky was a squirrel, while her friends were harder to make out. Honestly, I don't think they were even animals, like live-action cartoon characters. The show had apparently been my favourite thing to watch according to my mother. I would sit in our living room before and after school, and join in, singing with all of Mrs. Blinky's gang. I could name all of them when asked, and when Mum questioned me who my favourite was, I giggled and bowed my head, muttering that it definitely was not Mr. Gabbles. The rabbit/cow hybrid, with fluffy horns and a funny nose whose gag was to constantly fall over and make all the kids in the audience laugh. Mum said I would stay up way past my bedtime to wait for reruns, so I could excitedly point at his wide smile. He was the comic relief character, and was of course popular with kids for being the butt of every joke. I'm unsure if 5-year-olds can get crushes, but if they can, Mr. Gabbles was definitely my first crush. According to Mum's account of that night, I was barely fazed by the sound. Parents had reported delayed reactions in some kids, who had screamed and slammed their hands over their ears, while others suffered seizures. The majority of us were okay, I guess. I was too young to remember exactly what happened, but according to my mother, I had shuffled back from the television and complained of the colours in my eyes. The show was still playing, but in her words, it was suddenly muted, and the images were flickering and glitchy, like something else was trying to get through. When she first told Dad, he didn't believe her, but then multiple parents were saying the same thing. Some kids had gone into a trance, others shaking uncontrollably and collapsing, while the majority, like me, had been completely fine, bar a headache. It didn't make sense to our parents. 10 kids had been taken away, while the rest of us had survived. Mum said I never mentioned the high-pitched screech coming from the speakers, only grasping for the TV remote and changing the channel to cable. I wasn't the only kid who didn't appear to initially be affected by the noise, and days later, after it had been identified and we had been under scrutinizing testing by the town doctor, it was declared that Frequency X was an anomaly that was still being investigated, and for parents to not panic. An announcement had been made about the unfortunate deaths, and an order by officials to turn all electronics off inside places of residence. The mayor did speak about it in detail, but I didn't really understand what they were saying. The long words boggled my brain, and all I really understood was zap. He said that a lot. Zappy, zap, zap. The announcement we watched on TV made me laugh. He sounded like a Power Ranger. So, that's what we all started calling it. The thing which had killed, or in Mum's words, sent to sleep, Tyler Warren, who sat behind me in kindergarten, was called the Zap. I thought it sounded cool, like a comic book. But then the scary-looking men in black arrived at our door in a sleek sedan with blacked-out windows. They did not ask permission to come in, instead barging through our front door during dinner. There were two of them, Mr. Nice and Mr. Mean. Mr. Nice had glasses, while Mr. Mean wore a permanent scowl. They checked out the TV, asking Mum and Dad questions, which ended in Mum growing progressively red-faced until Dad had to take her outside. The men searched our house before giving me a glass of milk and making me sit down. Mr. Nice started with normal questions, like, "How are you feeling, Juniper?" I told him I didn't like that he had made my mum cry, and he did a fidgety shuffle thing with his whole chest, clasping his hands in his lap. To break the tension, Mr. Nice nodded at my stuffed rabbit, sitting on my lap. "Does the bunny have a name?" I shrugged. "Teddy." Mr. Mean cleared his throat. His eyes were dark. I didn't like them. "Can you hear anything inside your head, Juniper?" "Inside my head?" "Yes." While Mr. Mean stood with his arms folded in front of me, Mr. Nice slowly ducked to meet my height. He had a softer tone than his friend. "Can you close your eyes for me?" I nodded and squeezed my eyes shut. My mum was ushered from the room, and the door was shut behind her. I sensed the two of them stepping back. It was quiet for a moment. Too quiet. I felt each second pass by with almost painful precision, and was squirming in my chair when the man spoke softly, making me jump. "Okay, sweetie. Can you tell me if you heard anything?" "No." "Did you hear a ringing sound when it was all quiet?" "No." I was telling the truth. I really didn't. I just heard the uncomfortable and thick silence of the room, entwined with Mean's heavy breathing. When I asked what they meant by that, the scary people just smiled and shook their heads. But I did catch a look between them. It reminded me of the look Mum had on her face the following days after the incident. Relief. The two of them seemed to be telepathically talking to each other, with nods and jerks of their head, before turning to me. Nice took the reins, retaining that wide smile, which was starting to look a little fake now that I thought about it. He kept glancing at my stuffed rabbit. Mr. Mean politely asked my mum if they could have my medical records, while his colleague leaned over in his chair. his eyes a whole lot darker than I'd realized. "We're just making sure you're okay, sweetie." He nodded to my rabbit. "And so is Teddy." After the investigation was over, there was no closure to what happened to the kids and us. We could turn on our electronics again, and what happened was declared a freak accident. The worst snow of the season came a month later. I remember standing on the stone steps leading to our kindergarten gate and staring down at a fresh layer of snow beneath my bright red boots. It was almost as if the snow was covering up my classmates' untimely deaths. The snow took a lot of things away that winter. It took Mrs. Blinky too. To satisfy both grieving parents trying to understand why they were burying their 5-year-olds, and fuming ones terrified that it would happen again, Mrs. Blinky's playhouse was taken off of air. Not just that, it was erased, and every copy of its existence was completely wiped away. The channel stopped broadcasting, and after having a momentary scare for several weeks, with my parents keeping me away from the TV, convinced the radio waves were going to fry my brain too, things went back to normal. Well, 10 kids were dead, and the town was traumatized by something they did not understand. But as a 6-year-old, I had no idea what was going on. I do remember being pissed that Mrs. Blinky had been taken off of air and turned into a bad word at both school and home. Zach Chastity mentioned the show during quiet time, and he was sent out to have a conversation with our teacher. When he came back, he was red-faced and never talked about it again. Some parents had not bothered telling their kids that Blinky was no longer on TV, so kids were confused. There was a group of us, however, that attempted to keep the spirit of Mrs. Blinky alive. When the teacher wasn't listening or watching us, a small group of us would talk loudly about our favorite characters and episodes. It was great, until someone tattled. I was named the instigator by a paranoid parent, and Mum had a stern talk with me when I got home. A new rule was created and put into force, both in class and at home. If I talked about Mrs. Blinky, I would be sent to my room with the punishment of no dessert for a week. If I happened to mention the show or the characters, Mum pulled a face and calmly changed the subject. And when I persisted in demanding where my favorite character, Mr. Gabbles, was, she raised her voice, which made me stop asking. It's not hard to drill a certain rule into a kid's head, and I was beginning to associate Mum getting mad with mentioning Mrs. Blinky. So, I gave in and pushed the show from my mind. Years quickly passed, and life went back to normal. Several kids were picked out to keep having checkups every few weeks, due to sensitivity being picked up during testing. We still got visits from the men in black, getting less frequent when it became obvious that after 3 years, I really was okay. I had survived Frequency X. The last time I saw them, Mr. Nice gave me a popsicle, his colleague surprising me with the slightest quirk of a smile. It was progress. I was just happy to never see them again. The 10 kids that died were the lucky ones. Growing up, it became evident that a number of kids in the town had in fact been affected by the frequency, and symptoms were beginning to show with age. It started when I was 10, during math class. Jason Marriott clamped his hands over his ears, his eyes wide. "What is that?" he kept saying. But there was nothing. Just the tick of the clock and the droning sound of our teacher's voice. When it got so bad that he ran out of class, muttering that there was a weird noise in his ears, it turned out that he could hear our principal fidgeting with the intercom dial. I thought it was just happening to other kids, who stopped mid-walk to crinkle their noses and look around like they could hear something, slapping their hands over their ears during assembly when it was dead silent. And yet, they could hear something else. I thought I was safe. That was until I started to hear a tinny ringing sound when it was silent, and growing older, it got progressively louder, until I was no longer alone inside my mind. In the middle of the night when I was trying to sleep, it was there. A constant, never-ending ringing sound, like a coin rattling in a washing machine, which could only be suppressed by loud music. Whatever this sensitivity was, it started to appear in others. Luke Solfield, who sat behind me, told our teacher to turn her phone off, complaining that the squiggly noise was annoying him. Mrs. Tenner had taken out her phone, confused, realizing she had been calling someone. Kids started to call this thing a spidey sense, because it was kind of like having a superpower. Though the term was quickly forgotten when it started to take over our lives. Emma Bryan beat up a girl who intentionally blew a dog whistle, almost crippling her in the cafeteria. She was the school bully, and maybe had it coming. But seeing the girl on her hands and knees screaming, her cheeks red, tears streaming down her face as she begged her usual victim to stop, sent shivers down my spine. The principal started to ban walkie-talkies, and then phones, and then radios and dog whistles. Because when a bunch of middle schoolers realized their classmates could be sent to their knees just by playing with a walkie-talkie, or in some cases, just playing a song on Spotify, of course, they are going to take advantage. What started out as playful teasing became sabotage, with the use of simple noise. I turned 12 and was suddenly sensitive to television static, which felt like knives prickling in the back of my head. I started to pick up things I shouldn't be able to, like police talkies crackling to each other, and Mrs. Darby tuning in her ancient radio on the other side of the school. We were repeatedly told that it was just a phase, and that this sensitivity would eventually fade. But it didn't fade. It got worse with age. I started high school, and what had been a tinny ringing sound until then became a relentless screeching rattling in my skull when I was in the vicinity of anything emitting radio waves or frequencies. I was dragged to a homecoming game by a group of friends, lucky enough not to get the sensitivity, only to figure out the whole game was just an excuse for other kids to take advantage of the sensitive ones. I remember seeing them waving dog whistles and walkie-talkies like weapons, and those of us who were stupid enough to go to that game scattered before things turned messy. And things did turn messy. Reaching my mid-teens, my ears started to bleed when the TV was too loud. It wasn't just frequencies now. It was sound. This thing was ruining my life. Initially, I had been able to hear radio waves and what was riding on them. I could hear walkie-talkies and radio signals miles away. But now, I could hear something else. A crackling sound like I could sense the waves themselves, enveloping and entangling with each other, swimming in and out. I imagined several lines of bright color at the backs of my eyes. When it was at its worst, and I had to stuff my head in a pillow and swallow 2 Tylenol just to get rid of the brunt of it, I imagined the lines were brighter, blinding yellow and green. And when it was better, the colors were darker, blue and pink. I stopped going to school, opting to stay in my room where I wouldn't be attacked by invisible waves I could almost see. It's like, do you know when you're minding your own business and suddenly ringing? It was like that, but tenfold. Like that tinny ringing sound normal people sometimes hear, had been cranked to the highest volume. Mum dragged me to the town doctor, who told me the same thing he told me when I was 5, that I was fine, and that it was only early tinnitus. He clearly had no idea what the fuck was going on. And from the look on his face, I wasn't the only disheveled teenager dragged in by a parent. The reception area was full of us, and by now I could name them. There were 15 of us exactly, and could be identified through either the dead look on our faces, subdued clothing choices, or the stream of headphone wires entangling around us. Or, if they had rich parents, AirPods. The men in black, however, had a different diagnosis. They strode in with polite smiles and took over from the doctor, who was ushered away and shushed before he could attempt to stop them. After checking me over thoroughly, I was told that, yes, I was experiencing side effects from being blasted by the frequency at 5 years old. They didn't have the same reassuring tones as before. Mr. Nice spoke with a Hollywood smile and told me what he had told the other sensitive kids. As long as she is not exposed to it again, which might I say is highly unlikely, Juniper will be just fine. I hated that they were talking about me like I wasn't sitting right there. Mum was right next to me with a scowl on her face. And if she is exposed to it again? Nice didn't speak, but Mr. Mean was quick to jump in. He spoke with a curve in his lip and a gleam in his eye, which told me he knew a lot more than he was telling us. He didn't sugarcoat it. If your daughter was to be re-exposed to this frequency, Juniper would experience extreme pain, confusion, and nausea, followed by delusion that may lead to violence, depending on her sensitivity. When Mum made a noise, crossed between a squeak and a cry, he elaborated, "Thank God." Which would only happen if Juniper was, let's say, exposed to this phenomena for a prolonged period of time. I'm talking hours, days, and sometimes, if experiencing it in short bursts, perhaps months to a year. It really depends on how strong her mind is. We do not quite understand this thing fully yet, though we have a good idea. It can agitate the mind in ways we have not seen before, and in some ways, even hack its capabilities. From the information we gathered with the initial subjects subjugated by the frequency, autopsies revealed mutations we haven't seen before. When he spoke, his expression darkened, his tone matching. Like this was what was keeping them up at night. I caught Mr. Nice, swiftly elbowing him in the chest. Anyway, that is of course for us to worry about. His eyes flickered to me like he was searching my lips for something I wasn't telling him, trying to drag the words out of me. Juniper would quickly lose consciousness, unable to differentiate reality from a dream. In a sense, it would be like sleeping, peaceful like falling into a long slumber while the brain shuts down. If by then she is still exposed to it, an intracranial hemorrhage would occur, followed by death. Human brains cannot endure these kinds of frequencies, even in small quantities, and you are no different. If you would like an opinion from an unprofessional standpoint, none of your kids should be alive. Mr. Nice elbowed him again, but he ignored it. If this was to happen again, which it will not, you will. He mimed an explosion with his hands. Pop like a grape. Mr. Mean's gaze didn't stray from me, despite him talking directly to my horrified-looking mother. I was trying to figure out what popped like a grape would feel like, apart from the, agonizing pain he had described. You asked for the worst-case scenario, and I told you. He stood up. The odds of that happening, however, are very low. Mr. Nice nodded vigorously along to his words, shooting me patronizing smiles which were just making me more paranoid. In fact, you have a better chance of being struck by lightning 3 times. The man in black leaned back on the couch, ignoring Nice's attempts to get his attention with progressively more violent digs to his ribs. As I told you, Mrs. Lana, we have identified and destroyed the anomaly. Your daughter is fine. But what about the lines? I finally decided to speak up after sitting in silence, listening to my mother and 2 men in black, casually describing my demise in far too much detail. The colors in my eyes weren't helping. I blinked rapidly at the squiggly lines that appeared when Mr. Nice and Mr. Mean spoke. Nice was yellow and orange, while Mean was a purpley violet. I hadn't yet mentioned this recent development in my symptoms, because that would mean another trip to the emergency room and being stuck in an MRI machine. I didn't have to go in detail about why I hated it, but I will say it almost pushed me over the edge. I gestured the best I could to describe them, but I looked a little crazy. Unfortunately, the door was open, because fuck privacy, right? Rowan Wainwright, the mayor's son, whom the town had tried to downplay having the sensitivity, was frowning at me. I could only tell it was him from his long-ass nose. I used to laugh at him when he stood next to his dad on the television. Rowan Wainwright, who the town initially used as a "look, he's all better" ruse, definitely was not all better. Accompanied by 3 bodyguards, his sensitivity couldn't be hidden anymore. Especially when, just a few weeks earlier, he'd attacked a classmate for whistling. The boy's expression was tight, eyes narrowed. He was either taking the brunt of the screaming child some genius thought was a good idea to bring inside a room of hypersensitive people, or listening to our conversation. Maybe he could see the colors too. The mayor's kid surprised me when he shot me the finger, a beaded black bracelet jiggling on his wrist. Like other kids, his personality had taken a drastic turn after developing hypersensitive symptoms, with him getting overly defensive and argumentative to the point of being sent out of class. I looked away before I could get into a staring contest with him, and turned back to my least favorite agent's caterpillar eyebrows. Age had not been gentle to Mr. Nice. He nodded with that same fake smile. The lines you are describing are normal. Have you ever heard of synesthesia? I had, but he explained it anyway, basically telling me my mind was stimulated and tangled, and something about cognitive pathways. I tuned out when his voice turned yellow, twisting my head around. The mayor's son had his bedhead hair buried in his bundled up sweater, while the room around him blurred ultraviolet. Juniper. Mum elbowed me and I blinked, turning back to Mr. Nice's furry eyebrows. To soothe your sensitivity, might I suggest earplugs and listening to ocean sounds? I made a face, because what the fuck was I supposed to do with earplugs? I had tried every brand, every version. None of them even dulled the noise. I was about to shake my head no, when Nice reached into his pocket and handed me a small box. I plucked out what looked and felt like an earbud. I awkwardly lodged it into my ear, and Nice's smile grew. Consider them a gift, as well as a relief for your symptoms. And they were a relief. For 2 glorious years, I kept them corked in every night and day, reveling in silence. I wasn't sure how exactly the 2 of them did it, but the earbuds were magic. Obviously, they couldn't take it all away, so the colors were there to stay. But I saw it more as a light show with sound waves, eventually growing used to the ultraviolet rays every time someone screamed or a dog barked, and the plumes of blue and purple, then with thudding noises, cars passing, and my parents thudding down the stairs. My life came to an abrupt halt on a random Saturday during the summer. Mum forced me to circle the town, delivering Girl Scout cookies to get me out of my room. Sensitives was what we were named, and our condition was treated like a disability. I was 16 years old, and Mum still wouldn't let me anywhere near the TV. However, her favorite show was on, which meant I had no choice but to make myself scarce. Also an excuse for her to make me go outside. I had been put with 2 others. Harry Blake, who used his special earplugs as an excuse to ignore us, and Sadie, who hadn't spoken a word all day, lost in her own world. It was when our 3rd customer opened their door, and a head poked out. A face I could never have guessed had nefarious intentions. That was when Mr. Mean's words came back to haunt me, slamming into me in waves of ice water. A physical and mental attack, dragging me from my daydream, when colors flashed in front of my eyes. A rave of yellow and blue, and even red. A color I was yet to see grace my vision. The ultraviolet haze sent my sluggish mind into gear. Bad. I wanted to cry out to the others. This is bad. We need to get away. That's how we had been communicating with each other when we were overwhelmed by noise. If it was strong enough to take away our words and put a dent in our breathing, we had been taught to use our expressions instead. To scream. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe, talk, or move my facial muscles. My body and mind caught in an unyielding grasp. Mean's voice whirred in my skull, which would only happen if Juniper was, let's say, exposed to this phenomena for a prolonged period of time. We have not quite understood this thing fully yet, though we have a good idea. It can agitate the mind in ways we have not seen before, and in some ways, even hack its capabilities. I didn't understand what he meant until that very moment, standing under the late evening sun and watching Harry's eyes that had already been permanently rolling. Because in his words, why the fuck would I want to deliver cookies to boomers? Jolting into the back of his head with a sickening squishing sound. All of him seemed to jolt, to shudder, like he'd been struck by lightning. His hand wrapped around a pack of peanut butter creams, curled around the edge, the cookies slipping from his outstretched hand, where his fingers had adapted a mind of their own, jerking into a fist, and then a palm, and then going completely still. His eyes flickered, lip curling, like he could see something I couldn't. The frequency-proof plugs we had been wearing were no longer a protection. It just pierced right through. And maybe I was crazy, but I could almost sense the thing laughing at us. Oh, yeah, I thought, as an all too familiar sound filled my skull, and then my entire being, like tiny knives slicing through me and opening me up from the inside. That's why Mr. Mean had looked at me like that, with eyes that spoke of sympathy. I knew exactly what he wanted to say. If this thing could affect us in ways even two men in high government positions couldn't understand, then of course this thing could be weaponized. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could prove Mr. Mean's words. Time seemed to stop, and then start again, and then stop, like someone was pausing and playing us. Harry made a face like he was confused, and then confusion turned to pain, and pain collapsed into agony. But he didn't move, paralyzed to the spot. I didn't remember much of Mrs. Blinky's Playhouse's original run, but a specific scene had always stuck inside my head. Mrs. Blinky at the end of an episode about learning the names of sea creatures. She had gathered all of her friends around the campfire, made from orange and yellow streamers, and sang them to sleep. Her voice had been melodic, and almost sent me to sleep too. But I didn't want to miss seeing all of her friends slowly fall gently into each other. It was my favorite part. Time resumed, and the box of peanut butter creams hit the ground at the exact same time as Harry Blake slammed his hands over his ears and let out a shriek. I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. Nothing except a startling, vicious and ripping thing inside my ears and skull, bleeding into my mind. I realized a monster had made its way into my brain, twisting and contorting my mind into knots, when Mrs. Blinky started to count back from 10. No, not Mrs. Blinky. It was an oldish woman with greying hair and a terrifying, splitting grin. 10. Her smile was somehow stretching off of her face and into the air. Or maybe I was seeing things. I felt my mouth was full of something coppery and wet. It was all over me, pooling on my tongue and staining my teeth, dripping from me in rivulets. 9. The woman's voice was a witchy cackle, an over-exaggerated version of the original character. 8. Harry dropped first, onto his knees, and then flopping onto his stomach. His earbuds slipped from his ears, revealing a pinkish froth pooling onto the concrete. His head lolled, limbs twitching, attempting to reject this thing. 7. Sadie went over like a domino, almost crashing into me. I followed suit and dropped to my knees. I could feel nothing but the weight of my palms on my ears, and my own desperation to stay awake, to stay alive and stop the noise, slowly splitting my skull in half. 6. I think I screamed, but I just coughed up blood, large globules of it running down my chin and shirt. There were no words on my tongue, and what words I managed to cry out were muffled by copper filling between my lips. I was half aware of my body flopping onto warm concrete, and once I was lying on my stomach, my own body moving on its own, my arms and legs having minds of their own, did my head twist around, contorting under the force ripping my brain to shreds. Harry's body stopped writhing, his eyes flickering, before he went completely still. 5. I could sense the woman looming over them. She kicked Harry to see if he was dead. He was. Popped like a grape. When her foot slammed into his back and rolled him over, seeping scarlet followed in a stream. He was almost swimming in it. She crouched to my level, this time stroking through my hair and proddling my cheeks. Half conscious, the noise wasn't as bad as it had been. I still had my hands clamped over my ears, my head pressed into the concrete, sucking in sharp breaths. Could I play dead? 4. I waited to see if she would notice, to see if I could play dead and pretend I too had popped like a grape. The woman's breaths were too loud in my ears, and I risked peeling back one sticky palm, only for her to chuckle. 3, 2, 1. In quick succession, just like what I had watched as a kid. I was frozen on the ground, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for her to deliver the final blow. And she did. I didn't see her crank this thing to its highest setting, but I did see colors explode into the backs of my eyelids. This time I screamed. I screamed until my throat had a heartbeat and my face was pressed into my knees. When she grasped me by the hair between her bony fingers and wrenched my head up, I could see Harry and Sadie's bodies still rattling, still somehow alive, despite them being dead, despite them popping like fucking grapes. I found you. Those were her words before everything went dark. And I welcomed the dark. I welcomed the void where I could escape the overbearing monster digging further and further into my head. I didn't understand what she meant until I found and lost consciousness in flickers of light and dark. Colors and not colors, shapes and spirals and other squiggly doodles writhing in my vision as the noise continued cutting into me, and somehow not killing me. It had killed Harry in a matter of a minute, and then Sadie a second later. How was I still alive? I was inside a floral-looking living room. hanging upside down on someone's back. And that someone smelled exactly like my father. A mixture of cologne and rich shoe polish. It wasn't my dad though, because my dad died when I was 14. The man holding me had rough hands, keeping me in place. Harry's body was in front of me, wobbling on a stranger's back. I watched Harry the whole time that I found myself consciousness. I wanted him to wake up and tell me everything was lame, and I was weird for even worrying about this. I watched his eyes closely to see if they would open, when the floral wallpaper disappeared and made way for full walls of silver. It was an elevator. The grumble of the descent was powerful enough to plunge me back into darkness. When I woke for the final time, I was surrounded by a classroom-like setting. But it wasn't school. Whatever this classroom had once been was now abandoned. And yet, rows of desks still stood despite the decrepit surroundings. The walls were made of metal. The ceiling was metal. When I looked down, the floor was metal. There was one door, but it was guarded by 2 men in black. Not Mr. Nice and Mr. Mean. These guys wore heavy-looking weapons. The whiteboard in front of me was full of formulas I didn't understand. Initially, it felt like being at school, until I glimpsed worn Velcro strapped to my chair. Going into panic mode, I twisted around to look for an exit, which wasn't the guarded door. But when I did, when I cranked my neck and blinked into the heavy light illuminating the room, I found myself face to face with Mr. Gabbles. It was him. At least, the live-action version of him. His face was frozen in that same cartoon-like grin from my childhood, eyes sparkling with glee. Looking closer though, his fluffy horns looked filthy and stained, revealing red, while the fur of his suit was ragged. I could see exactly where Mr. Gabbles ended, and the teenager-sized human who had been stuffed into his suit began. There wasn't much of the person there, only noticeable in cuffed arms behind their back. Mr. Gabbles didn't move. I could see the threads in his eyes becoming loose, the stitches in his grinning mouth slowly coming apart. He wasn't alone. All of Mr. Blinky's friends were there. October 13th, 2010. A voice rang out, an ignition of yellow exploding into my vision. The scratchy voice of the woman dragged my gaze back to the front of the classroom. The woman was standing with her arms folded, her cold grey eyes boring into me. "We tested something we shouldn't have," she continued, beginning to pace back and forth. "It was supposed to ensure our children's minds would be protected from bad influences, and to be broadcast during a well-known beloved television show, which was of course filmed exactly where you are sitting. That's right. Your favorite furry friends were once in this very room. We were creating the next generation, and no harm, and I mean no harm, was supposed to come to any child." Her lip curled. "We were trying to help you, not hurt you." Mr. Gabbles muffled something behind me, which sounded like a whine. I turned to face the live-action cartoon character, but instead, my gaze glimpsed his human wrist bound to the chair. I knew that beaded bracelet sliding up and down a tanned arm. the mayor's son. But wasn't he supposed to be in Switzerland at boarding school? Ignoring Gabbles, my kidnapper continued. However, we found ourselves hijacked. Her eyes darkened. We did not know who or what it was. All we did know was that if we did not sever the signal, the entire children's populace of this town would have had their brains fried. I noticed her hands were shaking. It was too late, she whispered. The signal was already broadcasting, and we had no choice but to sacrifice 2 children to cut the connection and save all of you. The door opened, and 2 teens were brought in, a boy and a girl, both my age. The 2 were slumped in wheelchairs, vacant eyes staring straight forwards. There was a certain vacancy in their eyes, and I understood this woman's pain. My children, she whispered. I begged them not to. I told them that my kids had a right to survive, just like you. But you know what they said? The woman slammed her fist into the board with a crackly laugh. I jumped, the sound ringing my ears, orange and blue blurring into my feathered vision. It's your duty. She spat their words out. It is your duty to sacrifice 2 lives for several hundred, and you already made that choice when you joined us. When she finally turned to face the class, she was looking directly at me. Do you know what their favorite TV show was? The woman was already humming the Mrs. Blinky theme before picking something up off the desk at the front and making her way over to me. I finally realized what it was when she was plonking it onto my blood-stained desk. Mrs. Blinky. She was probably the most disgusting out of all of them. Ancient fur stained with different shades of old red, smearing her lips and chin. The floppy ears torn, stitches split open. Mrs. Blinky's Playhouse, of course. Her smile widened, and in the corner of my eye, a shadow with no identity was bleeding through the door. In their hands was the full human-sized suit for Mrs. Blinky. You're going to make them happy again, she whispered in a hoarse and manic giggle. You're going to make all the children happy again. She turned back to her own brain-dead kids with glittering eyes, and I couldn't move. With this cartoon head in front of me, wide animated eyes staring into my own, I considered pinching myself to see if I was having a nightmare. Maybe the magic of Mrs. Blinky can bring my babies back to me. I started to shake my head before it was there again. That cutting shriek, already rooted inside my skull, cracking me open once again, before I could cry out. It was there, writhing through me, forcing my mind into submission. I slammed my head into the desk and screamed, but no sound came out. I couldn't even hear my own raw screech, only the whoops and razor-sharp laughter around me, as the others cheered and stamped their feet, banging their fists on their desks. That's what Gabbles was doing. He wasn't screaming or crying out for help. When I risked turning around, his whole body was shuddering with laughter. That cartoon smile no longer playful. Instead, almost a feral grin. It hit me when I was rolling my head around the table and trying to bury myself into hard wood, that the others had been here longer. And if I concentrated, their laughing and cheering was razor sharp, almost animalistic and feral. It had already reached pain, agony, way beyond saving. Mr. Mean had spoken of delusion and losing your mind. Was this it? When the others continued into a cacophony of screeching laughter, reaching decibels that squeezed my brain into an unyielding grip, I was dragged to unstable feet, rough arms grasping hold of my arms before I could attempt to run. But there was nowhere to run. I don't remember much after that, except being pulled from that room and into another, where I was measured and then brutally forced into an ancient stinking suit. Before I knew it, I was standing on a well-lit stage, which was the exact stage I had watched as a little kid. In front of me were Harry and Sadie's bodies, propped up in an imaginary audience, as well as the woman's children. When the noise ran through me, it held no mercy, rattling my skull, something wet and warm spurting from my mouth. I could see it was affecting their corpses, and two of them doing a funny dance in their chair, their limp forms twitching like they were still alive. I flinched when a spotlight found me, drenched me in white light. The shadows behind the camera did not have faces. Lights! I was told to raise one large furry paw to confirm I was ready. I did, my body slowly beginning to hyperventilate. Blinding lights flashed on, a familiar voice cutting through the quiet, and I knew it well enough for it to slice into me. I had a moment where I forgot about the noise inside my head and the threat that my skull could be blown open any second. I fucking knew that voice. But somehow, my hands were moving to pull the furry head off before a voice spoke through gritted teeth. Gabble stood under his own spotlight. I could hear his heavy breaths bridging on hysterical giggles. Don't, the mayor's son said in a breathy laugh. Don't you fucking dare. Cameras! The Mrs. Blinky theme began, and I found myself staring straight through a stuffy mass of fur forced over my head. There were two tiny pinprick holes to see through, and all I could see was painfully bright light and the intense pooling scarlet pouring from the gaping hole in Sadie's forehead, as if this thing had torn a physical cavern inside her. Her smile was still bright. Action! And so began 1 year of relentless torture. The good news is that we got out. The bad news is that we got out. Hello, Sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.